Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 1 of Part 1 of the novel Sons and Lovers. This chapter is titled The Early Married Life of the Morels, and the novel opens with a brief historical survey of the development of the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire coalfield, as well as it gives us a picture of the building of the miners' houses called the bottoms. As far as the first scene is concerned, we find that how it shows the children's excitement at the Bestwood wakes and Mr. Morel's return with a coconut. This chapter basically concentrates on the contrast between Mr. and Mrs. Morel, and it shows that how these two characters, although they are quite different uh, in their personality, but still they got attracted to each other, which cast a kind of temporary spell, and this is what which brought them together. But finally it results in their in the inevitable process of disenchantment which Mrs. Morel faces, because it is after they get married, and after they get married, that this disillusionment follows, because Mrs. Morel discovers the lies that Mr. Morel has told her about his financial position, and we also get a sketchy view of Mrs. Morel's girlhood, like how she met with her future husband, as well as the first few months of their married life. Now, when their first child, William, takes birth, the conflict between the husband and the wife, which is a climax, because here in this chapter we find that how Mr. Morel cuts off the William's curls, of which Mrs. Morel was very fond. And this is actually, even we find that how Mr. Morel gradually gives in to his old drinking habits, and this chapter concludes narrating his excursion. Like on a day he goes on an excursion to Nottingham, and when he returns again, a quarrel, a very bad kind of quarrel takes place between him and the pregnant Mrs. Morel, which ends with her being locked out of the house for several hours. So basically, what we find that after William takes birth, Mrs. Morel's attachment to her first child, William, uh, is grows more and more. Not only that, when the novelist talks about the development of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, it also provides readers the kind of life that the working class led, and it also provides us with a picture of the working class environment. So beside this, we find that this this opening chapter describes Mrs. Morel's sensations as well, when she's left in the garden in the moonlight after the quarrel that takes place between Mrs. Morel and Mr. Morel. And this is actually an instance which which reflects D.H. Lawrence's ability to transform something which is very commonplace into powerfully resonant symbolism. So basically, chapter 1 deals with the early married life of the Morels and the kind of relationship that they share with each other, and it also reflects how Mrs. Morel's attachment to her first child, William, grows more and more because of a distance with her, because of the distance that develops between her and her husband. Chapter 2 is titled as The Birth of Paul Morel and Another Battle. So, what we find in this chapter is that Mrs. Morel's third child, Paul Morel, takes birth. And after the birth of Paul Morel, we find that how the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Morel gradually deteriorates. In fact, in this chapter, we find another character who is the congregational minister, Mr. Heaton, who comes to tea, and it is followed in, and there is another quarrel in this chapter between Mr. and Mrs. Morel. And what Mr. Morel does, he simply flings a drawer at Mrs. Morel, which hurts her on the forehead, and she bleeds badly. And after this incident, we find that the isolation of Mr. Morrill gradually heightens. He retreats more and more from his family life, and he takes refuge in the public house, and he gives in to drinking, and where he is very warmly received by the other drinkers. This chapter is in fact a series of uh, domestic vignettes which illustrates the deterioration in the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Morrill. As I said, that this chapter actually begins with a very attractive portrayal of Mr. Morrill, because we find that he prepares his own breakfast. In fact, uh, very we also find a sense of intimate private pleasure, but this the happiness that is enjoyed by him, it is basically a lonely happiness. And not only that, we find that Mr. Morrill does not approve of Mrs. Morrill's this respect, showing the show of respectability. Okay, and in fact, in retaliation, what he does, he exaggerates his own coarseness and vulgarity. Okay, because whatever Mrs. Morrill does, that is considered by him to be, self-indulgent manner. In fact, because of Mrs. Morrill's, let's say, elegant behavior, what he does, he gives into more and more vulgar behavior. So when we go through this chapter, we find that it is very much a dramatic episode, and it also adds to this growing sense of isolation of Mr. Morrill. After this, what we find is that as far as Mr. Morrill is concerned, what results in his isolation more and more is that the actions that he commits. Mr. Morrill, he also steals money from Mrs. Morrill's purse, and that actually marks a further decline of trust between them after it is discovered by Mrs. Morrill. Although he steals a pretty petty sum of money from his wife's purse, but still it affects the trust between them, and it makes him, pretend that he is living home. And this episode, this pretense on the part of Mr. Morrill is treated humorously by the novelist. In fact, when Mrs. Morrill she replies to William's query about his father's whereabouts, uh, she says that he says he has run away, suggests that it is as if it is a little boy's trick, and the bundle that is also discovered by Mrs. Morrill in the cold place is also treated mockingly by the novelist. So basically, it shows that Mr. Morrill doesn't have the courage to leave his home. He only pretends, and that makes him, that makes his personality lighter as well as frivolous in the eyes of his wife, because the bundle which was in its blue handkerchief, it's kind of becomes a comic emblem of Mr. Morrill's emotional defeat. So with this, we find that in this chapter reflects that how the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Morrill deteriorates, how the trust gets declined, and how Mr. Morrill gradually uh, descends into an isolated life, giving into drinking in the public house. Chapter 3 is titled as the casting off of Morrill and the taking on to William. In chapter 3, we find that Mr. Morrill is sick, but As he gradually recovers from his sickness, the distance between him and Mrs. Uh, Morrel grows more and more. In fact, she becomes less close to him. But again, another child is born to them who is Arthur. Now, the question that comes that although there is a distance between them, that what leads to, to the birth of their, to the birth of their child one after another. Now, since the couple represents the working class, maybe it was just because of their physical need that brought them together. But as far as emotional connection is concerned, or that emotional bonding or attachment is concerned, that was entirely absent. And as William grows up and Mrs. Morrel's distance grows, we find that her feelings become increasingly focused on William. In fact, she stands between William and Mr. Morrel. And the kind of response or the kind of behavior that is displayed by Mrs. Morrel towards William almost makes her appear as a lover. Like she becomes so possessive about William that she goes to the extent of feeling jealous of his going out, dancing and meeting girls. And in fact, when William gets a job in London, though she feels very happy, she gets very pleased by his promotion, but it actually, tortures her, torments her, and it leads to her anxiety, which is almost similar to the anxiety of a lover. That William's vanity will be flattered, by some girl there. So, as far as the title of this chapter is concerned, it is very much indicative of its theme because it shows that how Mr. Morrel is simply cast off and the entire attention of Mrs. Morrel gets diverted towards William. And the intimacy that we see between both of them during Mr. Morrel's illness is just a temporary one, a transient one. Apart from this, there is an episode in this chapter where Mr. Morrel threatens to punish William for having torn Anthony's collar because he receives a complaint from Mrs. Anthony. But here again, another quarrel takes place between both of them, between Mr. and Mrs. Morrel, and it shows the lack of understanding between them because it is through this episode that we come to understand this lack of understanding between them. Because on one hand, where we find the father all set to punish William after having received a complaint from Mrs. Anthony, and on the other hand, we find the mother standing completely in defense of William, which not only shows her strong personality, but it also reflects like where her actual emotional allegiance lies. Besides this, we find that the division between Mr. and Mrs. Morrel gets heightened because we find that they also differ with each other, regarding William's future. Mr. Morrel wants William to become a miner, a coal miner like him, while after having gone through her marital experience, after whatever Mrs. Morrel has experienced in relation to her husband, she is completely determined to get William educated because she doesn't want William, to live the life of a miner. Although we find that William begins his career as a clerk where he earns less compared to a miner, still we find that he emerges as a clever person, as a clever individual, and he also gains promotion and soon becomes rich. In fact, whatever he achieves in his life, his triumphs are a kind of a tribute to his mother, because when he there is an instance where we find that William goes and hands over his prize, his running prize, uh, to his mother. And how does she receive it? She simply receives his, running prize like a queen. But still, since he is also the son of Mr. Morrill, there is also a touch of his father in him, because just like Mr. Morrill, he is fond of dancing, which is not approved of by Mrs. Morrill. And not only that, he is also, since he's an adolescent, he's also given to flirtations with other girls. There is an incident where a girl comes to their place inquiring about him, and it is completely disapproved by Mrs. Morrill, which shows her puritanical disapproval, in fact. Though she doesn't seem to realize it, but what she's afraid of is she is afraid of the sexual displacement by a rival. So now we can see this, that if we look at the title now, Sons and Lovers, so here we can see the relevance of the title or the significance of the title, because we find a mother undergoing the anxiety of a lover. And as this chapter ends, we find there is a scene in which William goes through, all the love letters that he has received from several girls, and before he burns them, before he departs for London, we find him burning them. So the Mrs. Morrill in this chapter almost, resembles a lover. Almost her response, her reaction, her behavior towards her son William almost resembles that of a lover. And herein we find that how it adds a significance to the title of the novel, which is Sons and Lovers. Not only that, as I said, that whatever William succeeds or achieves in life, it is the result of his mother's contribution. Just as Mrs. Morrill is fond of William, William is also fond of his mother. But Mrs. Morrill's the kind of possessiveness that she shows about William, and her jealousy as well with regard to the company that he keeps, makes her almost resemble the character or the nature of a lover, and at the same time it reflects her fear and anxiety, because what she is afraid of, what she is anxious of, is she is afraid of losing his son William, because she feels that when he is going to London, like whatever affection he has for his mother, that will get replaced by someone else, which she cannot accept. It is indeed Mrs. Morrill's dissatisfaction with her husband. It is her dissatisfied marital life that makes her divert all her attention, all her care, affection towards her son William.